kind of processing everything that I've just learned. And I have some thoughts I kind of developed before hearing all of this, and I have some additional thoughts after hearing all of this. And I want to make sure there's enough time as well for a discussion. A lot of really provocative ideas presented. So, the main question guiding our panel tonight: do infrastructures of resilience in the service of greening agendas, sustainable food networks, and environment-friendly transportation alternatives combat or reinforce urban inequality? And I think, as Oscar put it, perhaps we should put a how in front of that question, as opposed to simply an open-ended question. But I think, however we frame it, it's an essential question. It's something that, in my own research, I've been thinking a great deal about, also in relation to questions of disaster and crisis, and the process whereby disasters become crises when there are uneven landscapes of risk and resiliency, and some communities have far greater resiliency than others. So, how do we understand resiliency as something that needs to be shared equitably, and how is it related to other systems of inequality? Yet, as essential as this question is, it has historically been all too infrequently asked at the level of contemporary urban policy and planning around notions of resiliency and sustainability. Where is it being asked? And I think the presentations today are really raising a lot of other spaces in which the question is being asked, certainly by communities in disaster-stricken areas, from Staten Island to New Orleans and beyond. It is increasingly being asked by cities and regions unequally threatened by climate change, which we can think about in this region as well as throughout the Americas and beyond. It has received a big boost this week with the release of de Blasio's One NYC, trying to put equity agendas at the center of long-range planning for sustainability and resilience. And other regional planning efforts are moving in a similar direction, we hear. So there is potentially hope that our analytic lenses are shifting and increasingly doing what Julian Aguiman refers to as the joined-up thinking that is necessary to address the interwoven issues of social and environmental resilience and sustainability, and the complex material role for our discussion today of infrastructure in these efforts. But I think that our panelists tonight are really on the cutting edge of social science and planning research that seeks to conjoin these frameworks and also show the difficulty in doing so and the messy politics involved in these efforts. They do so through careful, grounded analysis of leading efforts at building resilient infrastructures across different forms of infrastructure in a couple of the cases. So, these innovative new mitigation banking schemes, new green transport that encompasses BRT and bicycle lanes. I think, in the case of Andrew's work, less focused in what we heard today on, sustainable planning initiatives, and more the conditions upon which these initiatives are being formed, which are these inequitable food systems throughout large, expanding, suburbanizing areas, and the kind of infrastructural underpinnings that need to be understood for any urban policy that's going to be meaningful in addressing equity issues. These are scholars who are thinking across these different forms of infrastructure, different histories behind these infrastructures, and across some of the world's most highly unequal urban areas, New York City, Philadelphia, and Mexico City. And I thought best for us to start off maybe having a bit of a conversation amongst the three of you to kind of think across your cases, both infrastructural kinds of questions as well as the broader urban political issues that folks are dealing with and contending with and contesting these interventions. So a couple of questions to begin thinking maybe in your own case and across cases. One is, and I think that Melissa was kind of alluding to this at the end, the significance of politics and governance and the degree to which the local state can make a difference in interlinking resilient and equitable infrastructures or not, and if so, how. For instance, the recent shift from the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration, from Plan YC 2030 to One NYC, and whether this is a meaningful shift, whether indeed these development-driven approaches to resiliency is the true resilience that we're talking about here. So that kind of a question. But also for, in all cases, and we have the opportunity to think across different kinds of regimes. Are we just, dealing with a generalized system of neoliberal urbanization in which local governance is not going to make an impact? Are there possibilities at the state level for meaningful interventions? Another question has to do with the thinking about the materiality of the infrastructures that you all are looking at themselves. So the kind of socio-material assemblages that are bound up in these infrastructures. And how do you see the questions of equity and resilience affected differently by the particular materialities that you're dealing with? And I don't know if for any of you looking across these infrastructures, things came up that shone a light on the particularity also of your own, whether green infrastructure, food infrastructure, or transit infrastructure, and things we can learn across those kinds of cases. And then finally, sort of broader political questions, like what are we talking about? What would it mean in material terms to create what you might conceive of as true resilience in your sites? What kind of politics have you seen, or could you imagine bringing such resilience about? I think along these lines also questions of how environmental justice organizers and Right to the City organizers are thinking together and also differently about questions of resilience, and needing to kind of update to some degree their politics, given the fact that now they're no longer simply contending with people who don't have an environmental agenda but explicitly are foregrounding an environmental agenda. And so how does that affect, contentious and everyday politics? So I'm going to leave it there and open it up for our panelists, and then we can open it up for a broader. And anyone can, I think, if anyone else, we can just sort of have a broader, maybe we could go in order of seating, or I could, anyone can just jump in.
Go ahead. I'm still thinking.
Okay.
Well, I'll start with the second question first.
Okay.
About the question of materiality, which in terms of food distribution infrastructure is really a materiality of connection. And so thinking about how to rebuild connections that can overcome spatial exclusions is going to be one of the key issues of trying to address issues of access. And so access can work in multiple ways in this case, and there's kind of like a double materiality. There's a materiality on one hand of the infrastructure of connection, and then there's the materiality of merchandise, of the objects, and especially the objects that people really care about having access to, healthy foods. And so in that case, there needs to be a concern about how to build those connections, because we're talking about a highly perishable kind of object. And so to move high volumes of perishable objects from many locations to many locations creates all sorts of questions and political problems in terms of accessibility. And so maybe going from there to the first question of the significance of politics and governance. In Philadelphia, there have been major efforts to try to address these issues through public and private partnerships, trying to get some of the franchise businesses to move into neighborhoods that a lot of corporations historically wouldn't go into. And so helping them to fund the development, and then letting the franchises kind of operate as private entities to, build on all of their connections of moving materials. And so there you have a kind of interesting framework that actually has spread from Philadelphia to many other locations.
Are we going in order?
You can certainly respond to each other in terms of your own case, but
Yeah, I mean, the one that strikes me more is as relevant for my. All of them are relevant, but the one that I can address easier. I think it's I find really interesting is the question of the local government and what role can it play, or this governance, local governance. No? In the case that I'm studying, as I mentioned, there's this. All this interest in transportation comes around the same time that certain processes of local democratization and decentralization can begin to take shape and formalize. No? So I think more than thinking about whether the local might be the best way to go about it or not, it's actually like a lot of the root of all these initiatives are located in the local. No? And I think in thinking a little bit more ahead and beyond this particular case, when I'm thinking about BRT as this industrial, like the BRT industrial complex, no, as this larger political economy of sustainable transportation, I think local governments and very small scale interventions are become very important, because these are projects that pretty much any medium-sized city can undertake. No? So we're looking at a very different. Somebody here was asking me about the metro system. Somebody in the audience. I think the big difference between something like a BRT or a bicycle infrastructure project is that you can do it very quickly. So they kind of match these electoral cycles in a way. You can also, if you start looking into where the money comes from, and you look at these organizations that are responding to some extent and to funders such as the Volvo Foundation or the Shell, so you can see that it makes a lot of sense to break down a lot of these efforts into larger scale that you can move forward. No? So I don't want to focus too much on trying to point out the evil capitalists behind this project, but I think that the idea that it's easier to start in the local, it's pretty evident. No? Same thing with the mayor. For a while it's been well understood, or at least well known, that mayors were able to come up with more interesting agendas for climate change that local governments. I don't know if that's going to be the case in the future. It's the case now, but it's kind of like goes like. That's how I think about local governance. No? And I think if you want to go ahead, and then I'll come back with the other questions.
So I've been thinking about this, what you brought up about what is resilience, and I've been giving this a lot of thought, because I have, as the more I'm kind of looking at this, I have problems with that term, and I think it's, this kind of systemic thinking that progressives have been calling for a long time, that we have to think about things in this more holistic, systemic way, and now I'm starting to see some of the problems with that, where if you think of things as all part of this one system, then it's kind of like if you fix one part of the system, the idea is that you've kind of fixed other parts as well, but that's not necessarily the case, and the mitigation bank is a really good example of that. And so I think that it's sort of, it's becoming problematic in a different way than sustainability became problematic, but they both sort of were progressive ideas that became problematic. And so I'm concerned about that. And, I wonder how much the one NYC could play into some of those risks. I don't have an opinion at the moment on de Blasio. I know a few things about, his environmental, what I've observed from his environmental agenda, but I'm mostly going around asking other people what they think so far. So if anybody wants to comment on that, I'd be interested to hear about it.
Yeah, so, and thinking about how infrastructures, the particularity of infrastructures, their materiality is leading to certain kinds of political responses, but also certain kinds of political interventions leading to certain kinds of infrastructures, certain kinds of materialities that are beneficial for those local politics. So interesting comparison, I think, between these cases. But let's throw it open to folks and questions that people may have. We only have 9, but can we go a little beyond 8? Oh, good. Okay. I've been very mindful of time here. But we have a little bit more of it than I thought. Good. So.
This question is, I guess, for Andrew. I was in Philly in the fall, and we were looking at the sustainable urban food system there. And one of the places we visited was a food hub called Common Market, I believe. And there's part of this larger conversation about the role of food hubs in making and kind of rebuilding the infrastructure for regional food systems, because our food comes from all over the place, and part of the reason we don't see so much local food is because those are small and medium scale farms that can't deal with the scale of supermarkets and these wholesalers, and then these local food hubs are also a way of aggregating that food and making it more accessible, whereas typically you think of local food as being expensive. It's available at farmers markets and CSAs. So this local food hub is beneficial for those local producers as well as urban poor, maybe making this good food more physically and financially accessible. And there's been kind of, I believe it's in Louisville, there's this major food hub development. And there's talks about it in New York as well. So I'm curious how you see what role you see food hubs playing, if you think they'll be successful, how they'll relate to these supermarkets, this wholesale scale.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Common Market is very interesting and wonderful organization, actually, doing really, really great work. And my understanding, at least when I was doing the research, was that a lot of their work was on institutional connecting Common Market. So they were connecting local farms, and not small farms, but actually pretty large farms in New Jersey to institutional buyers like the University of Pennsylvania or Temple University or hospitals who can buy in larger quantities. And they were kind of developing somewhat of a niche doing that kind of work. And so I think there is a space for that, certainly. But that in terms of addressing questions of both food access and trying to link questions of food access to healthy consumption, that's a very different type of question. And you see kind of two agendas emerging simultaneously in Philadelphia, one oriented towards questions of access and equitable access and improved health for the public, and one about sustainable economies and sustainable farming and the connection between local farms and marketplaces. And so they're really kind of two different political agendas in a way that haven't unified a vision in a coherent way, which is in some ways unfortunate and maybe something that really people should be working toward. Because on one hand, there's a protection of farms, and so there's an issue of farmers are workers and need protection and need places to sell their products, and so which is why you see a sort of massive expansion of farmers markets in the United States, but also these food hubs that are expanding as well, really concerned about farmer productivity. And then the other side is consumer protection, and so these kinds of sides haven't really unified. And I think one of the reasons they haven't unified is because local production is such a small percentage of production. And so unless you're in California, where local production can be a vast enterprise. But maybe not, exactly. I mean, that's a whole other issue about sustainability. And so But I mean, it's a really important point. I think these are two sides that really do need to come together in a way.
This question is mostly about resilience, but I think it applies to all three of you. Resilience, but also I guess food distribution and transportation. They're very, in a sense, technical, and also involve the obviously interdependence of a lot of different players on a lot of different scales, including the regional scale. So I'm wondering how you would envision an equity agenda pushing up from the local scale in environmental justice communities.
I know what environmental justice activists get asked that kind of question a lot because they get accused of just pushing one hazardous waste site or one problem to another neighborhood, like a NIMBY kind of thing. And their answer is that they're trying to reduce consumption and change consumption overall. So they're trying to think more that nobody should have to bear these problems. And I would imagine they would have the same kind of answer about risk. Is that I don't know if they have anything specific, but I think they try to think regionally and not just in a really kind of neighborhood centric sort of way. Anybody else want to take that?
I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna give you a vision of what it will be like, but I could tell you what are some of the constraints of why, at least in the case of Mexico City, there isn't such a thing as a coherent proposal for a regional transportation equity policy or a movement towards that kind of stuff. To be honest, I don't know where in the world that's actually happening in a successful way. But just to go back to issues of governance and these things, I think, and materiality, in fact, there's, at least in my case, what I see is there's this fetishization of the new infrastructure, no? So you have to build something new. It has to look a certain way. It has to look green and sustainable, no? And I think in a case, in a complex metropolitan area like Mexico City, like many other cities, what's more important is not actual new construction or new infrastructure, but more of a retrofitting of the institutions and the legal frameworks that are sustaining certain patterns of urban development, certain patterns of economic growth, certain patterns of inequality. So I think at some point the kind of policies that I'm looking at, the kind of things that people are interested, are not that useful when it comes to thinking about a larger regional or any other like larger scale effort. No? So it's not a pretty picture, but that's kind of what I'm afraid I'm going to be looking at for the next few years.
One thing that I would just add to that real quickly, and maybe I can throw this out as somewhat of a question as well, is kind of the relationship between localization and standards, which sounds like the mitigation banking in some ways was struggling with that kind of issue. It's like, what role do standards play when you have local production? You're trying to extend out from the local, and maybe this is the case too with your case. Is that when you have this local production, the movement from local to something that is regional, there has to be a way of being able to transcend local interests that meet the different sides. And I think you see this with local foods as well, trying to get local foods into a kind of market apparatus. It has to fit into the standardization of the existing market system, and that becomes a very difficult thing for a lot of small-scale producers to be able to do. And I'd imagine there might be a similar kind of scenario in all of these kinds of cases.
So I have a question about, sorry, this is a loud mic. I have a question about climate change, basically, and I guess it's mainly directed to Oscar and Melissa, but anyone can jump in. And it seems like with both the cases here, there is a criticism or a critique of a project which is at least ostensibly designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, the Metro bus or densification in Staten Island. And I guess what I'm wondering is, it seems like there's a danger here of falling into the trap, which I know nobody wants to fall into, of counterposing sustainability and sustainability and like sort of social equity. And I guess I'm wondering if, and maybe this is a provocation to Melissa, if you're not able to go into the big systems thinking, I'm not sure how to get out of it. So for instance, with New York, if you don't develop more densification in New York City proper, then the alternatives are basically sprawl elsewhere or densification elsewhere. And there's not a great model right now for densifying suburbs in the US, although people are kind of trying. But that would suggest that an anti-development project in New York would have to be joined up with some kind of pro-densification project somewhere else. And obviously with Mexico and many cities in Latin America with BRT, highly problematic. But I guess I wonder, on the one hand, like, is it possible to find projects and to promote them which, maybe beyond environmental justice, really do combine a focus on carbon and social equity? And if not, given the urgency of the situation, aren't we as scholars / intellectuals / whatever basically responsible for trying to come up with those things to avoid basically being, if not actively, at least passively a part of the, the opposition between a social and an ecological approach?
I think we're just here to point out the problems. Just kidding. I just want to say that I think maybe I'm not necessarily against, or the people I work with aren't necessarily against densification on Staten Island. Some of them are, but the issue at stake with that is really that the infrastructure isn't keeping up. So they're bringing in more people, but they're not updating the sewer infrastructure, and that sort of speaks to the larger problem of these Band-Aid solutions. And that's what I'm sort of more trying to talk against, is that the solutions, like, it may not be as glamorous to talk about updating a storm sewer system, but it doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen. Otherwise, there's just going to be total, a disaster, literally. So.
Yeah, I have a somewhat similar approach. I mean, I'm not against any of these policies per se. Myself, I ride my bicycle every time I can, and I use mass transit and all these things. I don't like BRT as much as other systems, but I can live with it. But for me, the question is more about who gets to decide on these visions of the solutions or the visions of the future. No? So I think, yes, we can think about the environmental urgency or the sustainability component, the climate change dimension, but I think at the end, and I guess going back to the idea of environmental justice that you wanted us to discuss, the question is about whose idea of a sustainable city is the one that we're following, no? And in that sense, I think it's as important to think about the different solutions that we might go, the different roads that we can take, as much as thinking about how are we going to make that decision and who's going to participate on this, no? And I think you were just pointing to some of the things that I think are more important to pay attention to, which is this idea of urgency, no? With this sense of urgency, you can do a lot of things without thinking, about considering others, and that's something that I wanted to flesh out during my presentation. Is like if you want to build a sustainable city that's also democratic, but you're going to build it sustainable now and wait until the crisis already passed to address the democratic deficits. I don't know if that's going to happen, no? And we can think of many scenarios by which this could not happen. One of them would be that the planet Earth eventually implodes. But what if it doesn't? And then I can think of many movies that would present a very interesting vision of how it would look like if we are not thinking about how are we making these decisions. Not like bringing back the political into resilience, no? Or into sustainability.
Hello. So I'm I'm interested in a notion of competing resiliencies, particularly social resiliency. And there are, of course, multiple resiliencies and ideas of them, but thinking about infrastructures, built infrastructure, social infrastructure, and ecological infrastructure, kind of thinking that triad. I think on one hand, and I'm thinking particularly of an article by you, Melissa, on the Wiped Out by the Green Wave that really spoke to me as to how ecological infrastructure, greening infrastructure, the sustainability agenda can threaten or be detrimental to social frameworks, to social resiliency. And I think that's somewhat understood and particularly talked about, and it's now kind of on the agenda through One New York. I think it's realized as how built and ecological infrastructure can threaten social infrastructure. But I think for me that's quite paralyzing. So my question to you is, how can built and ecological infrastructure or resiliency enhance social infrastructure resiliency through thinking about food distribution, transportation, and your example of Staten Island, to kind of overcome that paralysis of the paradox, of the green paradox of resiliency of developing infrastructure?
I think, again, it's a question of really thinking. I think a lot of these solutions are very short term, even though they might sound like they're long term. And I think that if you really think, I think it is a kind of a very big picture thinking, a long term thinking, and sort of trying to think out what the consequences are of particular development. So if you're going to put in a new park or greenway or whatever, then it's also not doing it unless you're also putting in some kind of safeguards for affordable housing, to keep people there. And again, that sounds really kind of like utopian, but that's the only way I can really see to avoid these things. And also to, along with that, pass, a living wage and give people access to jobs. All of that stuff has to go together, I think. It's not just affordable housing. Anybody else?
Hi. I was struck when Miriam mentioned that the government had gotten the right to build more resilient infrastructures in Staten Island in some part. It just made me think that, who decides what resilience is? It seems like the voices of people on the ground might not be taken into account in what is resilient to them, because they're going to be facing the whatever shocks on the ground. So it seems like the solution would be to get all the voices. The problem would be that takes too long, and whatever we're facing is urgent. So I don't know if you have any ideas on how to gather all those voices, or the voices that may be required to make that resilient enough.
One thing really quickly. I think that idea that it would take too long, it takes a long time to put something in that's not solving the problem and then have to redo it, which we see happening over and over again. So if you're going to build like these flood walls or some of the gates or things that they're talking about, and then they're going to fail, what's the point of that? You spent billions of dollars. So I don't think it necessarily takes any longer to to try and listen to people and see what they're saying. And I think that a lot of people are probably, certainly there's dissent, but I think people may have more practical, workable, unified solutions than are, I think that that is some of the kind of pushback. Like, we have to act now, and we can't wait for people to just fight with each other and come to a consensus. And I think the point about democracy is a really good one, that you don't want to do one without the other.